The 11-day standoff in 1992 captivated the entire country.
Wanted by the FBI and a large number of federal agents.
He says the cabin
Randy
door was
Weaver is
essential
holed up with his
to
family.
securing victory.
August 21st, 1992. High in the quiet Idaho mountains, a family's peaceful existence shatters. Suddenly, they're surrounded by federal forces, ATF, U.S. Marshals, and the FBI's elite. A tense 10-day siege is about to erupt on Ruby Ridge, an event that will forever mark American history. When the dust settles, lives will be lost, shocking truths will surface, and the foothills of Idaho will never be the same. Welcome to Ruby Ridge. Randy Weaver, a decorated Green Beret, had served the United States Army with distinction for 3 years before receiving an honorable discharge. Upon returning to the state of Iowa, he traded his military uniform for the hard hat of an engineer, working tirelessly in the factories of his home state. Soon, Randy's life took a dramatic turn under the influence of his wife, Vicki. Vicki was a deeply religious woman who introduced him to books such as The Late Great Planet Earth, a book that was well known for forecasting the end of days. This exposure to apocalyptic publications, combined with Vicki's influence, led Randy down the path of becoming a doomsday prepper, aligning himself with far-right beliefs. Vicki then began having recurring dreams of their family surviving the apocalypse on a mountaintop. This eventually became a guiding vision for their future. Inspired by these dreams and the birth of their son Samuel, the Weavers decided on a radical lifestyle change. They sold all their possessions, learned how to live off the grid by spending time with the Amish, and eventually relocated to the remote wilderness of Idaho. Randy purchased 20 acres of land on Ruby Ridge. By the end of 1983, the Weavers had built a cabin and settled into their new life, raising 4 children in complete isolation. The family lived there without any of the comforts of electricity or running water. However, ongoing disputes with their neighbors prevented their efforts to achieve any peace and complete solitude. Randy's boastful claims of a kill zone around his property, where trespassers would be met with gunfire, unsettled the local community. Despite no reported incidents of any violence, these threats, coupled with the Weavers' increasing isolation and radical beliefs, led their neighbors to label them as anti-government radicals. During their stay at Ruby Ridge, Randy attended multiple meetings of the Aryan Nations and formed strong connections with the group. The Aryan Nation is a white supremacist group that believed in white superiority and identified themselves as Christians. Many outsiders labeled them as neo-Nazis, and rightfully so. Randy became acquainted with the leaders of the group, such as Frank Kumnick, which made him a target of future law enforcement crackdowns. What really broke the camel's back was when, in 1984, Randy had a dispute with his neighbor, Terry Kenninson, about the $3,000 land deal. Randy won the lawsuit and was paid $2,100 by Kenninson for legal fees. But Kenninson didn't stop there, as he wrote letters to the county sheriff and the FBI, alleging that Randy was spewing violent threats against them, then President Ronald Reagan, and other government officials, also claiming that Randy was a member of a neo-Nazi group like the Aryan Nations. In the 80s and 90s, law enforcement agencies were on a high alert and had surveillance on all anti-government and fascist groups. As times were changing, so were people's beliefs, which made then President Ronald Reagan form a special task force that infiltrated and demolished these groups from within, giving them no chance to grow and pose a threat to society. So any claims, allegations, or complaints that came to law enforcement agencies about members of radical groups were deemed to be on high alert. In 1985, after being notified about the Weavers' allegations, the FBI and the Secret Service launched an investigation into the Weavers. The couple was interviewed by 2 FBI agents, 2 Secret Service agents, the Boundary County Sheriff, and his chief investigator, during which they were asked about the allegations. Randy denied being a member of the Aryan Nations and denied the alleged threats that he was accused of making against Ronald Reagan. After the interview was concluded, no charges were filed against the Weavers and everything went back to normal, or so it seemed. After the interview, the Weavers became even more paranoid and infuriated towards the government, even filing an affidavit with the county courthouse alleging that their enemies were plotting against them and tried provoking the FBI to kill their family, but no one took them seriously. Chapter 2. enemies in plain sight. The Weavers were on the edge of paranoia on a daily basis, yet they tried to live out their daily life as a normal family. But little did they know that their paranoia was about to increase tenfold as their so-called enemies had them in their sights throughout the years. In 1986, after the FBI interview, Randy attended more Aryan Nations meetings and made a friend known as Gus Magasano. The two had similar interests when it came to radical far-right beliefs and even maintained their friendship for over 3 years, meeting several times to express their grievances and hatred towards the government. Randy developed a strong bond with Gus and even invited him over to his cabin, spending time talking about fighting the Zionist organized government. On July 1989, Randy invited Gus over to hang out at his cabin, during which Randy had a conversation about having money problems and how it's hard raising a family during these dangerous times. During the interaction, the two struck a deal, and Randy sold 2 sawed-off shotguns to Gus. The shotguns were shorter than the limit set by federal law, making them illegal firearms. In June of 1990, Randy was confronted by ATF agents who had an arrest warrant against him for selling illegal sawed-off shotguns to their informant. At this point, it was revealed to Randy that his so-called friend was actually an undercover ATF agent working as an informant to apprehend Aryan Nations leader Frank Kumanik. The ATF agents used the illegal gun charges as leverage against Randy and told him to become an ATF informant. By doing this, Randy's charges would be dropped. As tempting as the deal sounded, Randy refused to take it and said that he wouldn't become a snitch for the ATF. After hearing this, the ATF filed the gun charges against Randy. The ATF went even further and alleged that Randy was a bank robber with criminal convictions, even though there was no proof of these allegations. After pressing charges, the grand jury found Randy guilty of making and possessing such firearms. After the verdict, the ATF sought out ways to arrest Randy outside his property, as they feared that arresting Randy on his property would be dangerous. So they hatched a plan to arrest Randy and Vicky near their home, while posing as motorcyclists who needed help on the side of the road. By chance, the Weavers saw the posing ATF agents and assisted to help them, but Randy was apprehended on site and was told about the charges against him. Randy was released on bail and was told to appear on February 19, 1991 in court for his trial. Randy was under the supervision of Carl Richens, his new probation officer, and was instructed to be in contact with him when the court date arrived. As time went by, the court date was changed to February 20th in order to give the participants time to travel during a federal holiday. But it seemed that Richens misunderstood the update, and in a letter that mentioned a meetup with Randy, it stated that the court date was now March 20th instead of February 20th. This error would later prove to be the downfall of Randy and his family. On February 20th, Randy failed to appear in court, due to which a bench warrant was issued against Randy by Judge Ryan. Upon discovery of the error in Richens' letter, the chief probation officer contacted Ryan's clerk and notified them about the errors in the dates, yet Judge Ryan refused to withdraw the bench warrant. On March 14th, the U.S. Marshals called a grand jury, during which the grand jury issued an indictment against Randy for failure to appear in court. U.S. Marshals did not inform the jury about Richens' letter. With federal charges related to illegal gun sales and failure to appear in court looming over Randy's head, things would go from bad to worse in the coming months for the Weavers. Chapter 3. Assessing the Threat. As the Weavers' distrust and vendetta against the government grew, so did the law enforcement's eagerness of catching Randy. As the charges were filed, the U.S. Marshals were assigned to apprehend Randy at his local residence. For his multiple violations of the law, the U.S. Marshals, along with the collaboration of the ATF, started to gather information about the Weavers. After the charges were filed, the U.S. Marshals were assigned to apprehend Randy at his local residence for his multiple violations of the law. The U.S. Marshals, along with the collaboration with the ATF, started to gather information about the Weavers. This included past alleged behaviors regarding violence and extreme radicalism, along with taking precautions about the fact that the Weavers possessed firearms in their cabin. In order to avoid bloodshed, from March to October of 1991, the U.S. Marshals maintained negotiations with Randy in order for him to surrender peacefully, but Randy refused multiple times. Soon the negotiations stopped, and the U.S. Marshals became restless towards catching Randy, so they decided to surround Ruby Ridge with armed men and let their special teams assess the area around the Weavers' property. On March 27, 1992, the U.S. Marshals set up surveillance cameras around the Weavers' property in order to record their movements and activities. Through the surveillance footage, the U.S. Marshals saw that the Weavers took up arms every time a visitor or vehicle came near their property. The videos created an image of the Weavers of being hostile towards anyone who came near them. Due to false reports, bad assumptions of character, and poor background checking, the U.S. Marshals had assumed that the Weavers were a serious threat to the people of Idaho and needed to be dealt with one way or the other. So they pushed ahead and began the operation of apprehending Randy. Chapter 4. The Standoff. The day that Randy anticipated, but never hoped for, going down as one of the most traumatic events a family could ever go through. On August 21st, 1992, 18 months after the official missed court date, the U.S. Marshals began their operation of apprehending Randy around his property and determined suitable locations for his arrest. A team of 6 U.S. Marshals went on the reconnaissance mission towards Ruby Ridge. During the mission, 3 U.S. Marshals took observation posts, while other team members like Larry Cooper, Art Roderick, and William F. Deegan went ahead to survey the area around the property. As they got close to the cabin, the 3 Marshals held their position near the cabin and hid behind the woods when all of a sudden, the Weaver's dog, Stryker, picked up the Marshals' scent and began coming towards the source of the smell. Randy's 14-year-old son Sammy and longtime friend Harris saw that the dog picked up a scent and followed after it, based on the assumption of finding an animal to hunt for meat as the family was slowly running out of food. The dog rushed towards the source of the scent and discovered the 3 Marshals hiding in the woods. The dog started barking, due to which Art Roderick shot and killed it. Sammy and Harris feared for their lives as the U.S. Marshals were drawing in closer to their home. After seeing his dead dog, Sammy shouted, "You killed my dog, you son of a bitch," and took cover with Harris. When the Marshals advanced towards the position of the boys, Harris blindly fired bullets as a form of self-defense, due to which one of the bullets struck and killed U.S. Marshal Deegan. After seeing an opportunity to run back towards the cabin, Sammy left his position and went up the hill, but this risk would eventually be the death of young Sammy, as U.S. Marshal Cooper shot Sammy in the back, eventually killing him. After investigating Sammy's body, Harris ran back towards the cabin and told the family about the tragic events that happened. When the dust settled, the U.S. Marshals retreated to their stations and reported back to their supervisors. Upon hearing the news about the death of U.S. Marshal Deegan, Deputy U.S. Marshal Dave Hunt called for reinforcements and notified the FBI about the situation. After hearing the news, the FBI dispatched a hostage rescue team towards Ruby Ridge. The team consisted of FBI Special Ops snipers and hostage rescue agents. Meanwhile, the Weavers carried their dead son's body up the hill and stored him in a shed. These tragedies started the infamous 11-day standoff on Ruby Ridge. On August 22nd, the FBI's hostage rescue team arrived on site, and with clear orders from head office about the operation, they took the position where they got a clear view of the cabin and its vantage point. One sniper in particular, Lon Horichi, positioned himself 200 yards north from the Weaver's cabin, having clear sight of the Weaver's porch. During that time, Randy and Harris decided to visit young Sammy in the shed, while Vicky was behind the closed door, holding her 10-month-old child, Alicia. But the family couldn't even grieve properly, as Horichi saw an opportunity to take out Randy and Harris at the same time. The sniper shot Randy in the back and fired a second shot at Harris, wounding him in the chest, yet the two still survived. But all things were drained of hope when Harris realized that the second shot that went through him struck Vicky in the head. It seemed like the Weavers were being punished for the sins that they didn't even commit, losing 2 members of the family in a matter of days. Apart from the first 2 days of the standoff, no other blood was shed, as the remaining days were spent with law enforcement agents trying to negotiate with the Weavers outside their cabin. But they got no response or return from any member of the family, as they were still in grief and traumatized from the events that transpired. The poor soul in the wound, the hostage rescue team began mentioning Vicky and the children through their megaphones, saying things like, "What did Vicky and the kids have for breakfast this morning?" not knowing about the fact that Vicky was killed. For Randy, these 11 days were a living hell, as his wife's body was laying right in front of him on the cabin floor, His young daughters were hungry for days, and Harris was suffering from lethal wounds. After experiencing such bloodshed on grounds that he thought were sacred, Randy silenced the noise that was coming from the outside and focused on providing care for the people that were inside. As the standoff carried on, the incidents of Ruby Ridge gained national attention. Right-wing demonstrators started gathering along the road. The deaths of Sammy Weaver and U.S. Marshal William Deegan had become widely known, and shortly afterwards, the death of Vicki Weaver was also public knowledge. This incident served as a pivotal moment for the far right, reinforcing their opposition to the government and carrying lasting consequences even today. The negotiations with the Weavers was going nowhere and all seemed hopeless until the FBI contacted Bo Gritz, who was a Vietnam vet and a candidate for becoming president. Gritz volunteered to become the negotiator for the FBI and tried to stop the situation from escalating any further. Gritz shared some similar interests with Randy regarding white supremacy and racial segregation, so the FBI thought he was the perfect man to convince Randy into surrendering himself. Bo Gritz was given a warning by the hostage rescue team commander Richard Rogers that if his attempts at negotiation failed, they will launch a tactical assault on the cabin. On August 30th, Gritz went into the cabin and tried convincing Randy to surrender, but Randy refused, stating he'd rather die than give up. After hearing this response, Gritz directed his efforts towards Harris, who was severely injured and was in desperate need of medical attention. After spending some time in the cabin, Gritz was able to convince Harris to surrender, later being removed by a stretcher and transferred to Sacred Heart Medical Center. As time was running out, and with the commander's warning hovering over Gritz's head, he went back inside the cabin and tried to convince Randy again, but this time, he pointed out the fact that if he doesn't surrender, his daughter would be caught in the crossfire and he'd lose his family forever. Upon hearing this, Randy gave himself up to the authorities and Vicky's body was removed from the cabin. At last, the 11-day standoff on Ruby Ridge came to an end on August 31st, 1992. But Randy's story didn't end here. On April 1993, both Randy and Harris stood trial for a variety of federal offenses. The odds were stacked against Randy, but his defense attorney, Dave Spencer, focused on discrediting the government's false allegations against the Weavers and highlighted the incompetence of law enforcement's authorities. Spencer was able to convince the jury of Randy's innocence. He was found not guilty on all charges except for the two that were related to his failure to appear in court on the scheduled date and for violating the conditions of his bail, for which he was sentenced to 18 months in prison and a $10,000 bail. But due to good behavior, he spent only 16 months and was released from the Canyon County Jail. On the other hand, attorney David Nevin provided the defense for Harris, and he was found not guilty of all charges. 5 years later, in April 1997, Harris was indicted by Boundary County prosecutors for first-degree murder in the case of U.S. Marshal Deegan. However, the charge was later dismissed in early October, citing double jeopardy, as Harris had already been acquitted of the same charge in the federal criminal trial back in 1993. Chapter 5. Controversies and Criticism. There were many elements that led to the tragic events on Ruby Ridge, but the element that many investigators have criticized was the unjustified rules of engagement that the FBI changed and improved for the standoff in particular, before even dispatching the hostage rescue team and their snipers. According to multiple sources, the rules of engagement for the standoff stated that any adult holding a gun, whether assessed as a risk at the time or not, was to be put down with lethal force. This explained the reason why subordinates thought that the killing of Vicki Weaver and the unlawful shooting of Harris was justified during the operation. Even on the fourth day of the standoff, Danny Coulson, a deputy assistant director in the FBI, called out the cruel treatment of the Weavers and how the authorities escalated the situation. In his memo stating, "Charges against Weaver is bullshit. No one saw Weaver do any shooting. Vicki has no charges against her. In Weaver's defense, he ran down the hill to see what the dog was barking at. Some guys in camo shot his dog, started shooting at him, killed his son. Harris did the shooting. He is in a pretty strong legal position." At the time the memo was written, Coulson did not know that Vicki Weaver was already killed by one of his own men. The ATF's assessment about the Weavers being violent and dangerous individuals was blown completely out of proportions. Without background checks, they labeled Randy as a hostile individual with a criminal record, even though Randy had never been a part of any illegal acts in the past. They assumed that the Weavers' threats and paranoid anti-government ramblings were legitimate signs of being a danger to society, not even taking a second to think about gathering evidence and notifying the U.S. Marshals about the couple's clean record before executing the siege operation. Chapter 6. The Aftermath.
You call yourself an American? These are Americans. These are God-fearing people.
I know Randy, and he wouldn't hurt a soul. This is crazy.
I'll go up there right now if they'll drop me in by helicopter and die with them, because it ain't right.
Are you proud of yourself?
Baby killer! Baby killer!
In August of 1995, 3 years after the events of Ruby Ridge, Randy Weaver and his daughters initiate a legal action seeking compensation of $200 million due to the tragic loss of his wife and son. However, an agreement was reached outside of the court. As part of the settlement, the federal government provided Randy Weaver with $100,000, while each of his 3 daughters received $1 million. Importantly, the government did not acknowledge any wrongdoing or responsibility regarding the unfortunate deaths of Sammy and Vicky. As for Harris, despite federal officials vehemently stating that they would never compensate someone who had taken the life of a U.S. Marshal, Harris's attorney persisted in pursuing Harris's legal lawsuit for financial damages. Eventually, in September of 2000, the government granted Harris a settlement of $380,000. As a result of the Ruby Ridge incident, the FBI and other government organizations significantly revised their protocols for handling standoffs, placing less emphasis on resorting to violent confrontations unless absolutely necessary. Not only that, but there were also consequences within the FBI, such as demotions and suspensions affecting multiple individuals, including Richard Rogers, the commander of the Hostage Rescue Team, HRT. After the wrongful death of Vicky Weaver, an inquiry conducted by the Justice Task Force criticized Lon Hurichi for discharging his weapon through a door without being certain if anyone was present on the other side. While there is a disagreement regarding the approval of the rules of engagement that Lon followed, the task force strongly condemned these rules, which permitted firing without requiring a surrender request. In 1997, Dennis Woodbury, the prosecutor of Boundary County, indicted Lon on state charges of manslaughter shortly before the expiration of the statute of limitation for the offense. Woodbury assigned a special prosecutor to handle the case. However, in 1998, the trial was transferred to a federal court because Lon was acting within his official capacity as a federal law enforcement officer. Judge Lodge promptly dismissed the case, citing the principle of sovereignty immunity. Having left Ruby Ridge behind, Weaver and his daughters relocated to his native state of Iowa. Weaver gained some level of public recognition and authored a book detailing his personal journey, but he primarily focused on maintaining his privacy and caring for his family. Randy Weaver remained a resident of Iowa up until his death on May 11, 2022. Ruby Ridge, a scar on America's face, remains tangible proof of the fragile relationship between government and citizens. Its memory echoes even today, shaping our perception of law enforcement and individual rights. But the story of Ruby Ridge doesn't end with the last gavel strike or the final newspaper headline. It continues in every debate, every law, and every life touched by its ripple. It begs the question, in our pursuit of safety and order, how much freedom are we willing to sacrifice?